She wasn't even supposed to be at the outpost that day. Just a name on the duty roster. No special clearance, no combat training. No one paying attention when she quietly pointed out unusual satellite patterns before anyone else noticed. Then the enemy forces breached the communications firewall and broadcast a single message that silenced the entire command center. Who's firing? Where from? That's when everyone turned, because they weren't asking for the base commander. Weren't asking for the tactical team. They were asking about the woman they'd all dismissed as just another analyst. And what happened next? Nobody's forgotten since. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The intelligence briefing at Firebase Echo started before first light. Fluorescent bulbs humming overhead while the mountains outside remained shrouded in darkness. Intelligence Analyst Morgan Reeves sat at the far corner of the conference table. Her uniform wrinkled from the overnight shift, hands wrapped around a metal mug that had traveled with her through 3 deployments. 34 years old, steady eyes scanning reports that others had skimmed or dismissed. The mug itself told a story. Dented aluminum with a faded unit emblem from her first deployment. Back when she'd been someone worth consulting. Back when other analysts had asked her opinion on intelligence assessments instead of treating her like office furniture. She'd been given the nickname Oracle 5 years ago during her first major operation. Back then it felt earned. Now it felt like mockery from someone else's career. "This is a standard intelligence gathering mission," Captain Reynolds announced to the assembled team. 4 squads providing security for a high-value asset extraction along the mountain passage. Clear terrain, minimal threat assessment. He paused, glancing at his tablet. "We've got an additional analyst joining the team." The tactical operators exchanged glances. Morgan felt their eyes land on her like searchlights. She'd learned to recognize that look, the mixture of mild curiosity and subtle dismissal that came with being the person nobody expected much from anymore. Oracle will be monitoring communications in a support capacity. Non-essential parameters. Reynolds' tone made it clear she wasn't expected to do much beyond filing the paperwork afterward. Lieutenant Davis leaned toward his teammate and whispered just loud enough for Morgan to hear. "Another pencil pusher on the roster. Someone needs their field observation hours signed off." The nickname Pencil Pusher had stuck 16 months ago. Not cruel, exactly, but not respectful either. Just an acknowledgement that she was someone who handled the paperwork and cleanup that nobody else wanted to touch. The comment wasn't meant to hurt. After 16 months of riding the bench, she'd become invisible enough that most people forgot she could hear them. Morgan took another sip of coffee and kept her eyes on the mission parameters displayed on the screen. Topographical features, communication protocols, extraction timeline. She memorized them all, even though everyone in the room assumed she'd never need them. Sergeant Wilson, the team lead, glanced in her direction. "Oracle, you'll remain in the mobile command vehicle approximately half a mile behind the primary extraction team. Stay on backup communications unless specifically addressed. Our directive is observe and report only." "Copy," she said quietly. It was the same instruction she'd received on her last 14 missions. "Stay back, stay quiet. Try not to complicate things. The thing about being dismissed is that you learn to find purpose in preparation." Every morning for the past year and a half, Morgan had arrived at the intelligence center before anyone else. She'd run analysis on regions she wasn't assigned to, reviewed tactical assessments from missions she wasn't cleared for, studied engagement protocols for threats she'd never be authorized to handle. Not because she thought they'd ever put her back on a critical assignment that mattered, but because forgetting how to analyze threats felt like forgetting how to breathe. She'd been one of the top intelligence analysts in her graduating class, exceptional in pattern recognition, outstanding in threat assessment scenarios. Her instructors had called her intuitive, able to see connections between seemingly unrelated data points, like some people read music. For 7 years, she'd been exactly the kind of analyst the intelligence service needed. Methodical, insightful, reliable under pressure. Then came Operation Blackwater, and everything changed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The briefing broke up with the usual pre-mission chatter. Operators checking equipment, reviewing extraction points, making jokes to burn off pre-mission tension. Morgan gathered her materials quietly and headed for the door, but caught fragments of conversation as she passed. Not sure why they keep putting her on the roster. Heard she cracked during some classified op. Probably just needs the field hours to maintain certification. None of it was malicious. Just the casual dismissal of someone who'd gone from promising to peripheral. Morgan had learned to let it wash over her like ambient noise. Oracle, Captain Reynolds caught her before she could leave. Keep it simple out there. We don't need any complications. She nodded. Yes, sir. Standard protocols. What he didn't say, but what hung in the air between them, was that her last complication had cost her everything. 16 months ago, during a routine intelligence gathering mission in contested territory, she diverted resources to investigate what satellite imagery showed as a possible civilian encampment. Turned out to be a decoy. The team had to adjust their entire extraction plan to cover her unauthorized assessment. And by the time they'd returned to base, the incident report was already being drafted. Compromised operational judgment under pressure, the review board had concluded. Unsuitable for primary intelligence operations. They'd let her keep her credentials technically, but credentials without meaningful assignments were just paperwork. The truth was more complicated, but the truth lived in classified files that nobody wanted to open. The routine intelligence mission had been anything but routine. The contested territory had been a black site operation that officially didn't exist. And the civilian encampment she'd identified had been carrying intelligence that someone very much wanted to remain buried. But Morgan had learned that sometimes the truth was less important than the story people wanted to believe. Outside in the motor pool, 4 armored vehicles gleamed under the security lights like mechanized beasts. Morgan's assigned vehicle sat apart from the others. An older communications truck that had been retrofitted with extended range equipment and basic defensive capabilities. Not the kind of vehicle you'd send into an active engagement, but reliable enough for what everyone assumed would be a standard extraction. The support crew barely acknowledged her as she approached. No friendly banter, no last-minute equipment checks. They'd fueled the vehicle and run the basic diagnostics, but there was none of the careful attention she'd seen them give to the tactical vehicles. Her truck was just transportation, and everyone treated it that way. She ran her pre-mission checks with the methodical precision of someone who'd been doing it since her first day of training. Communication systems, intelligence gathering equipment, satellite uplinks, computer networks, everything exactly as it should be. Everything ready for a mission where she'd follow behind and try not to get in anyone's way. The routine was comforting in its familiarity. Check the communications array for interference. Test the satellite uplinks. Verify that all the monitoring systems calibrated properly during startup. Small rituals that connected her to thousands of other mornings. Other missions when her coding name had meant something different. The convoy departed as the sun finally crested the mountains. One by one, the tactical vehicles rolled through the base gates and onto the rough mountain road. Morgan brought up the rear, maintaining position several hundred yards behind the main formation. At the halfway point to the extraction zone, the landscape spread out below them like a detailed terrain model. Jagged mountains cut by winding roads and isolated villages. Dense forest rising in the distance like a dark wall. Beautiful in its way. Peaceful from this distance. Up here, with the mountains framing the horizon and the sky brightening to brilliant blue overhead, It was easy to forget about review boards and incident reports. Easy to remember why she'd wanted to become an analyst in the first place. "Ghost Team, this is Command," came the voice from base. "Satellite feeds report all systems nominal. Maintain current route and timeline." The team leader, Sergeant Wilson, acknowledged for the formation. Morgan monitored on the backup channel, staying quiet unless specifically addressed. That was the unspoken rule. Pencil pushers didn't clog the comms unless something was actively threatening the mission. For 53 minutes, it was exactly the routine mission everyone had expected. Clear satellite feeds, good weather, no deviations from the planned route. Morgan found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of intelligence monitoring. Constant adjustment of surveillance parameters, steady analysis of communications traffic, the meditative focus of keeping multiple intelligence streams precisely categorized. It was the kind of work that looked easy from the outside, but required absolute concentration. Every data point had to be properly contextualized. Every communication had to be analyzed not just for what it contained, but for what it might reveal in combination with other intelligence. Intelligence work was less about individual insights than collective patterns. The knowledge that every piece of information connected to something larger in ways that weren't always immediately obvious. Morgan had always been good at seeing those connections. Even now, relegated to the back of the convoy, she analyzed the intelligence feeds with the unconscious precision of someone who understood that good intelligence work was fundamentally about not missing crucial details. Then Command's voice cut through the routine with an urgency that made every operator in the convoy alert. "Ghost Team, we're showing signal disruption on primary satellite. Last telemetry indicated possible hostile contact bearing 045, numbers unknown." Wilson responded immediately. "Copy, Command." Moving to defensive posture, Morgan watched the tactical vehicles ahead of her spread into a wider formation. Each vehicle taking up positions that would allow them to respond to threats from multiple directions. It was a textbook maneuver executed with the smooth efficiency of operators who drilled it hundreds of times. She maintained her position behind them, but something on her surveillance monitor had caught her attention. There, barely visible in the satellite imagery, a heat signature that appeared for 3 frames and then vanished, reappeared 40 seconds later in a slightly different position, then disappeared again. The pattern was too regular to be environmental anomaly, but too intermittent to be a solid contact. Morgan had seen enough surveillance ghosts to know the difference between equipment malfunction and deliberate deception. She'd seen this pattern before. During her early years, when she'd been assigned to counterintelligence training, she'd learned to recognize the telltale signs of active thermal masking. The way a skilled operative could use terrain and environmental conditions to appear and disappear from detection systems. The way someone with intimate knowledge of satellite surveillance could dance just on the edge of visibility, showing themselves just enough to be noticed, but never enough to be tracked. It was the kind of technique that took years to master. The kind you only learned if you'd spent serious time studying how surveillance systems worked and how to defeat them. The kind she'd been teaching herself during all those early mornings in the simulation center. "Command Oracle," she said, keying her mic before she could talk herself out of it. "I'm seeing intermittent thermal signatures bearing 042. Pattern suggests deliberate masking." There was a pause. Then Wilson's voice, cool and professional. "Oracle, maintain position. We'll handle investigation." "Copy," she replied, but kept watching her monitor. The signature was still there, still playing the same game of electronic hide-and-seek. Whoever was out there knew exactly how to dance just on the edge of detection, appearing long enough to be noticed, but never long enough to be pinpointed. Morgan adjusted her thermal sensors and tried different filtering algorithms, hoping to get a cleaner read on whatever was out there. The signature's behavior reminded her of something from her advanced training, a specific evasion technique that had been classified above her clearance level back then. But she remembered the instructor's description. When someone doesn't want to be seen, but needs to maintain situational awareness, they'll use intermittent masking. Show themselves just enough to see you, and disappear before you can see them. Ghost lead command. We're not showing any signatures on primary satellite. Can you confirm visual? Wilson's response was crisp. Negative visual contact. Feeds are clean. But Morgan's feed wasn't clean. The ghost signature was still there, still following its carefully choreographed pattern of appearance and disappearance. She started to key her mic again, then hesitated. The last time she reported something that nobody else could see, it had ended her career. Then every communication device in the convoy exploded with static. For 4 seconds, the electromagnetic spectrum filled with white noise so intense it hurt to listen to. When it cleared, a new voice was speaking on their frequency. Male, calm, speaking unencrypted English with the faintest accent that could have been Chechen or Georgian or Azerbaijani. Ghost team, this is an unofficial contact requesting information on who's firing from your position and where exactly they're located. The convoy went silent. Morgan felt her blood turn to ice water. In her earpiece, she could hear Wilson breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. Someone had not only penetrated their encrypted communications, but had done it so completely that they were speaking in clear text on a frequency that was supposed to be impossible to intercept. Wilson found his voice first. Unknown contact. You are in violation of secure communications. Identify yourself and state your intentions. The response came back immediately, as if the speaker had been expecting exactly that reaction. I have no interest in your convoy. I need only to know who has been engaging our forces from your region. The firing patterns match someone we've encountered before. Morgan's hands tightened on her equipment console. In 9 years of intelligence work, she'd never heard anything like this. Enemy forces didn't request conversations over open frequencies. They certainly didn't do it over channels where every intelligence agency in the region could listen in. Oracle, Wilson's voice was sharp over the tactical channel. Do you have any idea what this is about? She hesitated for 3 heartbeats. The voice was familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition she couldn't quite place. Like hearing a half-remembered conversation from a time in your life you tried to forget. Negative lead. No contact with unknown actors. But even as she said it, she was thinking about black sites and classified briefings and missions that officially never happened. About the 16 months she'd spent buried in paperwork and forgotten assignments, filing reports that disappeared into databases she'd never see again. The unknown voice spoke again, and this time there was something in his tone that made Morgan's chest tighten with recognition. She couldn't quite place. Someone knows what Blackwater was. Someone was there when the real operation ended. The words hit her like a physical blow. Blackwater, a designation that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, attached to an operation that had been scrubbed from every official record she'd ever seen. But she remembered. 16 months ago, an intelligence-gathering mission that had gone sideways when their field assessment turned out to be intentionally misleading. She'd been monitoring communications for an extraction team when everything fell apart. When the shooting started and the original intelligence became worthless and someone had to make a choice between following protocol and preventing a massacre. The mission had been presented to her as a routine high-value target extraction. Asset acquisition from a militant facility that had become temporarily accessible. Standard procedure. Monitor communications. Provide intelligence support while the field team collected their target. Extract. Except, the facility hadn't been militant. It had been a civilian research center. And the target hadn't been a high-value enemy operative. It had been 3 scientists who'd been working there for over 2 years without any connection to hostile forces. And the field team hadn't been there to extract them. They'd been there to eliminate them and their research. Morgan had figured it out during the final approach. When she'd intercepted encrypted communications between unknown parties, discussing cleanup and containment in terms that had nothing to do with asset extraction, she'd made the choice. Broken communications protocol, broken the intelligence assessment chain, broken every rule about field analyst conduct to get 11 people out of a kill zone the command structure hadn't even acknowledged existed. Officially, Blackwater had never happened. The after-action reports listed it as a training exercise with unexpected variables. Unofficially, it had ended her career. Unknown contact, Wilson was saying. You need to identify yourself immediately, or we will consider you hostile. My identification is irrelevant. I need to know who's engaging our forces and from where. The pattern matches someone I've encountered before. Morgan closed her eyes for 1 second, feeling the weight of a decision she didn't want to make. When she opened them, her hands were steady on the communications console, and her voice was calm. Command, this is Oracle requesting permission to establish independent contact with unknown communicator. The radio exploded with voices. Wilson shouting for her to maintain communications protocol. Command demanding clarification of her request. Someone from intelligence services asking if she'd lost her mind. Through it all, the unknown voice waited patiently. Finally, a new voice cut through the chaos. Colonel Hargrove, the regional commander, speaking directly from the command center. Oracle, explain your request. Morgan took a breath. Sir, the unknown contact has referenced a classified operation that I was involved in. I believe he has information relevant to current intelligence priorities. What she didn't say was that she recognized something in the voice now. A cadence, a way of pronouncing certain words that reminded her of someone she'd heard during those final chaotic minutes of Blackwater. Someone who'd been on the wrong side of the communications that night, coordinating the forces they'd been trying to escape. Someone who should have been dead. Permission granted, Hargrove said after a long pause. But you maintain position. No unauthorized actions. Morgan switched to a discrete frequency she'd noticed the unknown contact had been monitoring. This is Oracle. I'm listening. Hello, Morgan. Her blood froze. He'd used her real name. You have me at a disadvantage, she said, fighting to keep her voice level. I think you know who I am. You should. You saved my life 16 months ago. And suddenly she did know. The voice belonged to someone who'd been operating a surveillance network over contested territory when Blackwater went bad. Someone who'd been coordinating with forces that were supposed to eliminate her team. Someone she'd broken every protocol in the manual to extract along with her own people. Because in that moment, intercepting his communications with his own commanders, ordering him to facilitate the slaughter of civilians, she'd realized he wasn't the enemy. Someone who disappeared into the intelligence void the moment they'd returned to base. Nazir, she said quietly. You're supposed to be dead. I'm supposed to be a lot of things. None of them worked out according to plan. Morgan glanced at her surveillance monitor where the intermittent signature was still playing electronic hide-and-seek. What do you want? To return a favor. There's something happening that you need to know about. Something that involves both of us. I'm listening. Not over communications. Meet me at checkpoint 7 alone. Morgan felt her team leader's eyes on her through the vehicle window, even though she knew Wilson was driving 3 miles ahead of her. I can't authorize that. You authorized Blackwater. This is smaller. She was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the past 16 months, about sitting in briefing rooms where no one expected her to speak, about joining missions where her job was to stay out of the way, about the careful, gradual erosion of everything she'd worked to become, about the fact that someone who'd been hunted for 16 months had risked exposure to contact her specifically. Give me 5 minutes, she said. She switched back to the command frequency. Command, Oracle requesting permission to investigate the unknown contact at forward position. Negative, Wilson cut in immediately. You maintain convoy position. But Colonel Hargrove overrode him. Oracle, you have authorization for limited investigation. Weapons cold. Return on command. Copy. Morgan accelerated her vehicle, passing the tactical formation. The operators stared at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility as she drove past. Behind her, the formation grew smaller and more distant. Ahead of her, at checkpoint 7, someone who should have been dead was waiting with information that apparently couldn't be shared over even secured channels. At checkpoint 7, she finally saw him. The man was unlike anyone in her recognition database. Lean and weathered with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore clothing that could have belonged to any of a dozen regional groups, but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had received professional training. Didn't expect you to actually come, he said as she approached. Neither did I. They stood in silence for 30 seconds. Two ghosts at the edge of a conflict zone before Nasir spoke again. They buried Blackwater, but they couldn't bury what we learned there. About the weapons dealers? About the shell companies? About the people who were supposed to be overseeing the operations? What are you talking about? The real reason Blackwater went bad wasn't faulty intelligence. It was sabotage. Someone wanted that operation to fail. Wanted everyone involved to disappear. Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You're saying we were set up. I'm saying we were loose ends, and someone is still trying to tie us off. They stood in silence while she processed this. Around them, the mountains loomed indifferent and eternal. Above them, satellites that could see a cigarette being lit from orbit passed unseeing overhead. Why are you telling me this? She asked finally. Because they've been trying to kill me for 16 months, and I just found out they're coming for you next. What? This extraction? The high-value asset recovery, it's not what they told you. The person you're extracting is connected to Blackwater. Someone who is supposed to have been transferred to Allied custody, but has been held at a black site that officially doesn't exist. Morgan's hands tightened involuntarily. How do you know this? Because I've been watching, learning, staying one step ahead of people who want me erased. He paused. Your name came up in their communications yesterday. They know you remember too much about that night. So what do you want me to do about it? Help me finish what we started. There's evidence at that black site that proves Blackwater was intentionally compromised. Evidence that can bring down the people responsible. And if I say no, then you go back to your convoy, finish your mission, and hope they let you live long enough to retire quietly. Morgan looked down at her watch. She had maybe 15 minutes before she'd have to head back to the convoy. 15 minutes to decide whether to trust someone who'd been living in the shadows for 16 months. What's the plan? She asked. Nasir gestured toward a coordinate that wasn't on any of her official maps. Follow me. For the second time in 16 months, Morgan Reeves made a choice that would end her career. She turned her vehicle away from her convoy, away from her mission, away from everything safe and sanctioned and officially approved, and followed a ghost into territory that didn't exist on any official map. Behind her, the radio erupted with voices demanding her return. Ahead of her, a man who should have been dead was leading her toward answers she'd been afraid to look for. Driving through territory that belonged to no recognized authority, Morgan finally understood what Oracle had always meant. Not a mythological figure who told the future, but an analyst who decided which truths deserved to be revealed. 28 minutes later, her vehicle's fuel warning light came on and reality reasserted itself. She had to turn back, had to face the consequences of following someone into unauthorized territory, had to explain to her commanding officer why she'd abandoned her mission to chase shadows. But as she turned toward base, Nazir's voice crackled over the radio one last time. "Morgan, watch your back. And when they come for you, and they will, remember that being called a pencil pusher isn't the worst thing they can do to someone who knows too much." The drive back to base was the longest 45 minutes of her career. When she finally arrived, half the command staff was waiting at the gate. Their faces told her everything she needed to know about her future in intelligence operations. But for the first time in 16 months, Morgan Reeves felt like herself again, like someone worth asking for by name. 8 hours later, sitting in a windowless debriefing room while intelligence officers asked the same questions over and over, she thought about ghosts and shadows and the difference between being invisible and being forgotten. Colonel Hargrove entered the room at 2,200 hours, carrying a digital tablet that looked heavier than it should have. He dismissed the other officers with a look and sat down across from her. "Oracle," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "Yes, sir." "That man you met today, we've been tracking him for 16 months. Never could get close enough for positive identification." He unlocked the tablet and showed her a surveillance photo. "Until today." The image showed Nazir from multiple angles. High-resolution photos taken from her vehicle's own cameras during their encounter. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was a tattoo that shouldn't have existed. "This man was supposed to have been eliminated 16 months ago," Hargrove continued. "Along with his entire network." Morgan said nothing. "The thing is, the operative who was supposed to have led the elimination was listed as Nazir Kadyrov, former regional intelligence asset, defected to Allied forces during a black operation that officially never happened." He showed her another image on the tablet. It showed a younger Nazir in Western clothing standing beside a military vehicle. "He was one of ours," Morgan said. "Had been for 6 years before Blackwater went wrong." She felt the pieces clicking into place. He wasn't coordinating hostile forces that night. He was coordinating our extraction. And when the operation went sideways, when someone decided the researchers needed to disappear permanently, he refused the order, same as you did. So they tried to kill him. They succeeded officially. Nazir Kadyrov died in a car accident 2 months after Blackwater. Closed casket funeral, classified burial site. Hargrove set the tablet down. "Except today, he used an unauthorized communication channel to contact you directly, and then led you to a coordinate that our satellites have been watching for 16 months. What's at that coordinate?" "Evidence. Documents, communications logs, everything we need to prove that Blackwater wasn't an intelligence failure. It was treason." They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Morgan asked, "What happens now?" "Now you're getting your credentials back. Full operational authorization. Immediate reinstatement." Hargrove smiled grimly. "Turns out we need analysts who don't follow protocols when the protocols are wrong. And Nazir. That depends on whether he's willing to come in from the cold, and whether you're willing to help us convince him." Morgan thought about a voice in the darkness asking for her by name. About 16 months of being dismissed and forgotten and relegated to the margins. About the difference between being a pencil pusher and being someone worth calling for. "When do we start?" she asked. 2 weeks later, Morgan Reeves stood in the intelligence center at dawn, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. She was wearing a new uniform with a fresh identification badge, Oracle, in silver lettering against black background. Below it, in smaller text, Special Intelligence Division. Her station wasn't a backup communications vehicle anymore. They'd given her a fully equipped intelligence center, complete with authorization to access information from anywhere in the world that required analysis and protection. But today, she wasn't monitoring a mission. She was waiting for a ghost to come home. At 0600, a signal appeared on her secure communications channel. No identification, no clearance code, no official acknowledgement. Just an operative who'd been living in the shadows for 16 months, finally ready to trust someone enough to make contact. As Nazir's encrypted message appeared on her screen, Morgan keyed her response. "Welcome back, Ghost." His reply came back clear and strong. "Good to be here, Oracle." And for the first time since Blackwater, she felt like her codey name meant something again. They could take your clearance. They could bury your career. They could classify you into irrelevance. But they couldn't take away the fact that when it mattered, when someone who'd survived 16 months in the darkness needed help, they'd asked for you by name on a frequency the whole world could hear. Morgan closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The operations center hummed around her, analysts and operators preparing for missions that would shape global security. When she opened her eyes, she was looking at a priority alert on her screen. An unauthorized transmission had been detected in a region that was supposed to be secure. The intelligence director looked up from his station. "Oracle, what do you make of this?" 3 months ago, no one would have asked her opinion. Now they turned to her first. "Let me analyze the pattern," she said, fingers already moving across her keyboard, accessing systems that had been locked to her for over a year. The transmission pattern looked familiar, but with subtle variations she hadn't seen before. It reminded her of communications she'd intercepted during Blackwater, but more sophisticated, more carefully disguised. Someone was trying very hard to hide their presence, yet wanted specific people to notice. "It's a contact attempt," she said finally. "Someone's trying to reach us." "Hostile?" the director asked. "No." She studied the frequency pattern. "It's one of ours. Someone deep undercover who needs extraction." "How can you be sure?" Morgan pointed to a specific modulation in the signal. "This pattern here. It's a recognition code we developed for Blackwater. Only 3 people ever knew it. And 2 of them are in this building," Nazir said from behind her. He'd been allowed limited access to the intelligence center under her direct supervision. "Who's the 3rd? the director asked. Morgan and Nazir exchanged glances. "Dr. Eliana Mercer," Morgan said. "Lead researcher at the facility we extracted during Blackwater. The one who was supposed to have been transferred to Allied custody. The one who disappeared into the system," Nazir added. The director frowned. "What's the protocol for this kind of contact?" Morgan straightened her shoulders. "Standard protocol would be to ignore it. Log it as an anomaly and continue normal operations." "And what do you recommend?" She thought about 16 months of following protocols that kept her silent and sidelined. About the difference between doing what was expected and doing what was right. "I recommend we answer." The director studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Make it happen, Oracle." 3 hours later, Morgan sat in a secure communications room, composing a response that would reach someone who'd been forgotten by the system that was supposed to protect her. Someone who, like Morgan herself, had been filed away and dismissed when she became inconvenient. As she worked, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for too long. This wasn't just about finding one researcher or exposing one conspiracy. It was about remembering that systems were only as good as the people who operated them, and that sometimes the most important intelligence came from the voices no one was listening to. "Will she trust us?" one of the junior analysts asked. Morgan looked up from her work. "She'd trust us because we're trusting her. Because we're listening when no one else would. Is that enough?" She thought about a dark night 16 months ago, about choices made under impossible pressure, about voices calling her name when everything was falling apart. It has to be. Sometimes trust is the only operational advantage we have. As she sent the response, carefully encoded with markers only Dr. Mercer would recognize, Morgan realized that what had once been her greatest professional failure had become her most valuable expertise. She understood what it meant to be forgotten by the system. She knew how to speak to people who had been betrayed by the organizations they served. And most importantly, she knew that sometimes the most crucial intelligence came from the shadows, from the places no one else was willing to look. The transmission sent, confirmation received. Now they would wait to see if their ghost in the field would answer. Whether the woman whose life Morgan had helped save 16 months ago still had enough faith to trust them one more time. "Do you think she's still alive?" Nasir asked quietly. Morgan closed her eyes, remembering the chaos of the extraction. The determined face of the researcher who had refused to leave without her data. The courage it had taken to trust strangers in the middle of a firefight. "Yes," she said finally. "People like Dr. Mercer don't disappear easily. They fight. They survive. They find ways to finish what they started. Like you did." Morgan looked around the operations center, at the analysts and operators who now turned to her for guidance. At the system she had once again been entrusted to monitor. At the missions she was once again helping to shape. Like we all did. The screen in front of her blinked once, twice. A response. Encrypted, disguised as routine communications traffic, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. "She's alive," Morgan said, the relief in her voice audible to everyone in the room. "And she has the evidence." The director leaned over her shoulder. "Can you bring her in?" Morgan studied the coordinates embedded in the message. Remote, difficult terrain, multiple hostile forces in the region. "Yes," she said with quiet confidence. "I can bring her in." "How can you be so sure?" Morgan thought about all the mornings she'd arrived at the intelligence center before anyone else. All the scenarios she'd studied when no one was watching. All the skills she'd honed even when no one asked her to use them. "Because I've been preparing for this exact mission for 16 months. I just didn't know it yet." Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the one person who sees what no one else can. Sometimes the analyst they call pencil pusher is exactly the one who can read between the lines when lives depend on it. Morgan Reeves hadn't planned to become the most important intelligence asset in a covert operation that could reshape global security. She hadn't asked to be the one person a ghost from the past would trust with information that could bring down conspirators at the highest levels. But as she prepared to coordinate the extraction of Dr. Eliana Mercer, she realized that everything in her career, including 16 months of being sidelined and forgotten, had prepared her for this moment. Because when you've been invisible, you learn to see what others miss. When you've been silenced, you learn to hear what others ignore. And when someone asks, "Who's firing? Where from?" sometimes the answer comes from the analyst no one expected to speak at all. The extraction plan for Dr. Eliana Mercer was unlike anything the intelligence division had attempted in years. Not because the terrain was particularly challenging, although the remote mountain valley certainly qualified, but because the entire operation had to be invisible not just to hostile forces, but to certain elements within their own command structure. "We still don't know how high this goes," Colonel Hargrove said during the final briefing. "So this stays completely off book until Dr. Mercer is secure and her evidence is authenticated." Morgan nodded, studying the topographical display with the focus of someone who understood that terrain was more than just elevation lines on a map. It was cover and concealment. It was movement corridors. It was the difference between a successful extraction and a disaster that could never be acknowledged. "4-person team," she said, pointing to the entry route she'd selected. "Small enough to avoid detection, large enough to provide necessary security." Nasir, standing at the edge of the room, still not entirely trusted by most of the operations staff, nodded his approval. "The valley narrows here. Perfect choke point if we need to manage pursuers." "Who's on the team?" Hargrove asked. Morgan highlighted 4 personnel files on her tablet. "Wilson and Davis." The director raised an eyebrow. "The same Wilson and Davis who've been dismissing you for 16 months? The ones who called you a pencil pusher?" "The very same," Morgan said with the faintest smile. "They're the best tactical operators we have. And more importantly, They have no connections to anyone who might be involved with Blackwater. They won't take orders from you. They will if you tell them to." Hargrove studied her for a long moment. "And the fourth?" "Me." The room went silent. Morgan had expected resistance, but she'd also prepared for it. Before anyone could object, she continued, "I've passed all field qualifications. My tactical ratings are still valid. And most importantly, I'm the only one Dr. Mercer will recognize besides Nazir, who can't go because he's officially dead." Hargrove finished for her. "Exactly." The colonel tapped his fingers on the table, considering. "The tactical team won't like it. They don't have to like it. They just have to execute." Her directness seemed to surprise him. The Morgan Reeves of 16 months ago would have apologized for suggesting she join a field operation. Would have offered alternatives, accommodations, compromises. That Morgan was gone. "Approved," Hargrove said finally. "But you maintain communication with base at all times. Any sign that this is more complicated than a straightforward extraction, and you pull back immediately." She nodded, but they both knew that nothing about this mission would be straightforward. As the briefing broke up, Nazir approached her. "They're underestimating you again." "Good, you've changed." Morgan thought about all the mornings she'd arrived early to train. All the simulations she'd run when no one was watching. All the skills she'd quietly honed while everyone assumed she was just going through the motions to maintain basic certifications. "I didn't change," she said quietly. "I just stopped hiding." The team assembly went exactly as predicted. Wilson and Davis received their assignment with barely disguised contempt. Being tasked to a high-risk extraction was expected. It was their specialty, after all. Being told they would be working under the direct command of an analyst they'd dismissed as a pencil pusher for over a year was not. "With all due respect, sir," Wilson said to Hargrove, not bothering to hide his frustration, "Reeves hasn't led a field operation in over 2 years." "And whose fault is that?" Morgan asked before Hargrove could respond. Wilson turned to her, surprise evident on his face. He'd clearly expected her to remain silent while the real operators discussed her shortcomings. "Excuse me?" "I said, whose fault is that?" "I've maintained all tactical qualifications. I've passed every field readiness evaluation. I've requested operational assignments 14 times in the past 16 months. She stepped closer, her voice level but intense. "So tell me, Sergeant Wilson, is it my fault that I haven't led a field operation? Or is it because people like you decided that one controversial call meant I wasn't worth listening to anymore?" The room went silent. Davis stared at his boots. Hargrove watched with an expression that might have been approval. Wilson stood frozen, clearly uncertain how to respond to this version of Morgan Reeves who didn't apologize for existing. "We deploy in 4 hours," she continued, turning back to the mission parameters. "I suggest you review the extraction plan I've developed. If you have tactical improvements to suggest, I'm open to them. If you just want to complain about who's giving the orders, save it for your performance review." 4 hours later, Morgan found herself checking her equipment with the methodical precision of someone who understood that in the field, overlooking a single detail could be fatal. Body armor fitted properly. Communication systems tested and functional. Weapons cleaned and loaded. Medical supplies accessible. Everything in its place. Everything ready for a mission that officially didn't exist. The familiarity of the routine centered her. In the midst of everything that had changed her position, her confidence, the way others saw her, these basic preparations remained the same. The foundation of successful operations had always been attention to detail, whether you were an analyst monitoring communications or an operator preparing to enter hostile territory. She looked up to find Wilson watching her, his expression unreadable. "Problem, Sergeant?" she asked. "Just making sure you remember which end of the rifle the bullets come out of, ma'am." The sarcasm was expected. What surprised her was the faint trace of respect underneath it. "I remember," she said simply. "Just like I remember the extraction pattern you prefer for high-risk environments, and the fact that you always check your primary weapon 3 times but your sidearm only twice." His eyebrows rose slightly. "I've been paying attention, Sergeant Wilson. Even when you weren't." She shouldered her pack and headed for the transport, leaving him to process the fact that the analyst he'd dismissed had been studying him the entire time. The insertion went as smoothly as such things ever do. A high-altitude drop into the mountains, followed by a 4-mile hike to the pre-arranged meeting point with Dr. Mercer. The terrain was brutal steep slopes covered in loose rock. Narrow passes that could be death traps if anyone was watching. Valleys that funneled wind into howling gales that could drown out the sound of an approaching threat. But Morgan moved through it with the confidence of someone who had spent months studying satellite imagery and topographical models, memorizing every contour and shadow. Davis, bringing up the rear, muttered something that might have been reluctant approval. "You've done this before," he said during a brief rest. "Not officially," she replied. They reached the meeting point 20 minutes ahead of schedule, a sheltered depression in the mountainside that offered good visibility of the approaches while providing cover from aerial surveillance. "Now we wait," Morgan said, setting up the surveillance equipment that would allow them to detect anyone approaching within a 2-mile radius. "If your contact doesn't show?" Wilson asked. "She show." "How can you be so sure?" Morgan adjusted the surveillance parameters. Thinking about Dr. Eliana Mercer, the brilliant researcher she'd helped extract 16 months ago. The woman who had risked everything to preserve her work when others wanted it destroyed. Because she spent 16 months surviving in a world that wanted her erased. She didn't do that just to disappear again at the finish line. Wilson nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing something in Morgan's tone. The understanding that came from experiencing the same kind of erasure, the same kind of dismissal. "What's her story anyway?" Davis asked. "This mysterious doctor we're risking our necks for?" Morgan considered how much to share. These men hadn't been part of Blackwater. Hadn't seen what happened when intelligence agencies decided certain research was too dangerous to exist, certain people too inconvenient to protect. Dr. Mercer was developing advanced surveillance technology, the kind that could track not just individuals, but patterns of behavior across entire populations. The kind that could predict social movements before they happened. "Sounds useful," Wilson commented. It was, until she realized her work was being used not to protect vulnerable populations, but to identify them for elimination. Davis whistled low. "And let me guess, when she objected, suddenly she became a threat to national security." "Something like that." "So why is she reaching out now? After all this time?" Morgan adjusted the surveillance again, watching the mountain passes for any sign of movement. "Because she finished her work. Not the weapon they wanted her to build, but the evidence that proves who was really behind it. Evidence that can bring down people powerful enough to make entire operations disappear from the record." Wilson was silent for a long moment, perhaps reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the analyst he'd dismissed as a pencil pusher. "And they sent you to bring her in." "They sent us," Morgan corrected. "A team they could trust." Before he could respond, the surveillance equipment picked up movement from the eastern approach. A single figure, moving steadily despite the difficult terrain. Moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory alone. "Contact," Morgan said, adjusting the optics to confirm identification. The image clarified, revealing a woman in her 40s, lean and weathered from months of survival. Her clothing was nondescript, the kind that would blend in anywhere in the region, but her movement pattern was distinctive. The deliberate pace of someone conserving energy while remaining constantly alert. "That's her," Morgan confirmed. "Exactly on schedule." Wilson raised an eyebrow. Impressive for someone who's been off the grid for over a year. Dr. Mercer was never what anyone expected, Morgan said, preparing the recognition signal they had arranged. That's why she survived. The extraction should have been simple. A straightforward rendezvous, verification of identity, and immediate withdrawal to the extraction point where a helicopter would be waiting during a brief window of opportunity. Simple, clean, by the book. But operations involving people who officially didn't exist were rarely simple. Morgan's first indication that something was wrong came when Dr. Mercer altered her approach path, suddenly veering away from the direct route they had established. It wasn't a major deviation, nothing that would trigger alerts for someone who wasn't watching carefully, but to Morgan, who had spent years studying movement patterns and behavioral indicators, it spoke volumes. Something's off, she said, adjusting the surveillance to widen the search perimeter. She's still coming, Wilson pointed out. Yes, but she's changed her approach. She's using terrain features for cover now, moving like she's being watched. Davis scanned the surrounding mountains with his optics. I'm not seeing anyone else out there. Neither am I, Morgan admitted. But she is. She made a quick decision, the kind that had once ended her career, but now might save a life. Wilson Davis, establish overwatch positions here and here. She indicated 2 elevated points that would provide clear fields of fire across the most likely approach routes. I'm going to move to intercept her directly. That's not the plan, Wilson objected. The plan assumed we weren't being observed. Dr. Mercer's behavior suggests otherwise. Or she's just being cautious, Davis suggested. Either way, we need to adjust. If she's right and someone is watching, we need to get her under protection immediately. If she's just being cautious, no harm done. She could see Wilson weighing the options, his tactical training battling with his instinctive resistance to following her lead. Fine, he said finally. But maintain constant communication. First sign of actual hostile contact, you pull back and we reassess. Morgan nodded, already checking her weapon and adjusting her communications. Understood. Moving through the mountainous terrain with the careful precision of someone who knew that speed and safety were often competing priorities, Morgan made her way toward Dr. Mercer's new approach vector. The rocky ground made silent movement nearly impossible, but she used the gusting wind to mask the sound of her advance, timing her movements to coincide with the strongest gusts. When she finally spotted Dr. Mercer, the researcher was crouched behind a boulder, surveying the path ahead with the wary attention of someone who had learned the hard way that survival depended on seeing threats before they saw you. Morgan approached from a direction that would keep her visible, her hands clearly displayed to show she wasn't an immediate threat. Even so, she saw Dr. Mercer tense, one hand moving toward what was likely a concealed weapon. Oracle sends her regards, Morgan called softly, using the recognition phrase they had established. Dr. Mercer's posture changed immediately, relief visible even at this distance. The ghost thanks her for remembering, she responded, completing the verification. Morgan closed the distance between them, finally getting a clear look at the woman she had helped save 16 months ago. Dr. Eliana Mercer had been elegant then, with the poised confidence of a brilliant mind accustomed to respect. Now she was harder, leaner, her eyes constantly moving, assessing, calculating. 16 months of survival had transformed her from an academic into something closer to a soldier. You came yourself, Mercer said, surprise evident in her voice. I promised I would. That was 16 months ago. People's promises don't usually last that long. Mine do. Dr. Mercer studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. That's why I contacted you. I needed someone who understood what it means to be erased from the record. We need to move, Morgan said, glancing back toward the extraction point where Wilson and Davis were providing overwatch. My team has established security, and we have an extraction window in 57 minutes. We can't use your planned extraction route, Mercer said immediately. They're watching it. Who's watching? The same people who've been hunting me since Blackwater. The ones who tried to erase my research when they couldn't control it. Morgan quickly accessed her tactical options, considering alternate routes, evaluating risk factors, calculating time constraints. You're sure they're out there? We haven't detected any surveillance. Dr. Mercer's laugh was short and bitter. Of course not. They're using my own technology to track us. The prototype was designed to be undetectable by conventional means. Then how do you know they're there? Because I built in a flaw. A detection signature that only appears when the system is actively tracking a specific target. She tapped the small device strapped to her wrist. It's been alerting for the past 20 minutes. They found us. Or they will, very soon. Morgan processed this information with the rapid assessment skills that had once made her one of the agency's top analysts. If hostile forces were tracking them using advanced technology, their entire extraction plan was compromised. Wilson Davis, she said into her communications device. Change of plans. Extraction route is compromised. Rally at alternate position 3. Copy that, Wilson responded, the skepticism in his voice obvious even over the static-filled connection. Any confirmation of hostile presence? Morgan looked at Dr. Mercer, saw the absolute certainty in the researcher's eyes, remembered what it had cost her 16 months ago when she'd ignored her own instincts in favor of official assessments. Confirmed hostile surveillance using advanced technology. Fall back to alternate position and prepare for potential engagement. She turned to Dr. Mercer. You have the evidence with you? The researcher patted the weatherproof case secured to her back. Everything. Communications logs, development records, authorization chains. Enough to prove that Blackwater wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was a deliberate attempt to weaponize my research while eliminating anyone who knew its true purpose. We need to move now. If they have your tracking technology, they'll have deployed assets to intercept us at the most likely extraction points. Mercer finished for her. Standard containment protocol. How many? Based on the surveillance pattern, at least 2 teams of 3. Possibly air support on standby. Morgan quickly revised her mental model of the situation. 6 hostile operators with unknown capabilities, potentially supported by aircraft, against her team of 3 and a civilian researcher. Not favorable odds by any tactical calculation. Then we don't use any of the likely extraction points, she decided. We create our own. Dr. Mercer looked at her with newfound respect, perhaps recognizing the shift in the analyst she'd known 16 months ago. The transformation from someone who followed protocols to someone who rewrote them when necessary. What's the plan? First, we move. Fast and quiet. Then we turn their surveillance against them. As they made their way across the rocky terrain toward the rally point where Wilson and Davis would be waiting, Morgan explained her improvised strategy. It was risky, dependent on variables she couldn't fully control, but it was also the kind of adaptive thinking that no surveillance algorithm could easily predict. They expect us to run, she said, helping Dr. Mercer navigate a particularly treacherous section of loose rock. To head for the nearest extraction point, to try to outpace their interception teams. That's what most extraction teams would do, Mercer agreed. Exactly. Which is why we're going to do the opposite. We're going to move toward them. Mercer stopped short. That's suicide. It's unexpected. Their surveillance is designed to predict typical evasion patterns. It won't be optimized to recognize a deliberate engagement strategy. You want to attack them? 4 against 6 with unknown air support? Morgan smiled slightly. I want them to think we're going to attack them. There's a difference. Understanding dawned in the researcher's eyes. A deception operation. Precisely. We create movement patterns that suggest we're maneuvering for engagement. They'll consolidate their forces to defend against a threat that isn't coming, while we slip through the gap they create. And the extraction? Morgan checked her communications device, confirming the encrypted channel was still secure. Already working on it. My base team is repositioning our transport to a location they'll never expect us to use. When they reached the rally point, Wilson and Davis were waiting, weapons ready, expressions tense. "Explain," Wilson said without preamble. Morgan laid out the situation quickly, the advanced surveillance, the hostile teams, the compromised extraction plan. Then she presented her alternative strategy. "You want us to fake an attack posture to draw them into a defensive consolidation, then extract through territory they've already cleared?" Davis summarized. "Yes, that's..." he began. "Brilliant," Wilson finished, surprising everyone. "High risk, but if their surveillance is as predictive as you say, it could work." Morgan studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine tactical approval or simply resignation to a desperate plan. "You're not going to argue that we should stick to standard extraction protocols? Fall back to the secondary extraction point and call for additional support?" Wilson's smile was grim. "Ma'am, if what you're saying is true, standard protocols will get us all killed. I've spent 16 months thinking you were just a pencil pusher who froze under pressure. If I was wrong about that, I can admit it. And if I'm wrong about this plan, then we'll all be too dead to argue about it." It was as close to an apology as she was likely to get from a man who had spent his career believing that field operations were no place for intelligence analysts. "Let's move," she said, accepting the olive branch for what it was. "Dr. Mercer, stay between us. If your tracking device indicates any change in their surveillance pattern, tell me immediately." The next 40 minutes were a masterclass in tactical deception, moving in patterns that would register as offensive maneuvers to any surveillance algorithm. The team created the impression of a force preparing to engage a superior enemy, setting up flanking positions, establishing fire lanes, moving in ways that suggested a coordinated attack was imminent, all while actually working their way toward the new extraction point that Nasir and Colonel Hargrove had arranged, a narrow valley 2 miles east of their original destination, accessible only through a series of switchbacks that would be nearly impossible to monitor from the air. "It's working," Dr. Mercer reported, checking her detection device. "They're consolidating forces here and here." She indicated 2 positions on the rough map Morgan had drawn, moving to defensive posture rather than continuing their advance. "Perfect," Morgan said. "Now we slip through the gap they've created and make for the extraction point." The final approach to the extraction site was the most dangerous, a stretch of relatively open ground that offered little cover from observation. But Morgan had timed their movement perfectly, using the fading light of dusk and the natural shadows of the mountains to conceal their progress. "There," Wilson said softly, pointing to the narrow opening between 2 rock formations. "That's our entry point." Morgan nodded, studying the approach with the careful attention to detail that had once made her an exceptional analyst and now made her an effective field operative. "Davis, take point. Wilson, cover our 6. Dr. Mercer, stay close to me." As they made their final approach, moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had found its rhythm, despite the compressed timeline and high-pressure circumstances, Morgan felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the imminent success of their mission. 16 months ago, these men wouldn't have followed her to the mess hall. Now they were executing her tactical plan without question, trusting her judgment in a life-or-death situation. Not because she had demanded their respect, but because she had earned it through competence and clarity of purpose. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses becomes the one person who can see what no one else can. Sometimes the analyst they call a pencil pusher is exactly the one who can rewrite the playbook when everything is on the line. And sometimes when the enemy asks, "Who's firing? Where from?" the answer comes from someone they never expected to hear from again. The extraction helicopter appeared exactly on schedule. descending into the narrow valley with the controlled precision of a pilot who understood that margins for error in mountain terrain were measured in inches, not feet. The rotor wash kicked up dust and small stones, momentarily reducing visibility to near zero as Morgan guided Dr. Mercer toward the aircraft while Wilson and Davis maintained security positions. "Go!" Morgan shouted over the roar of the engine, helping the researcher climb aboard. "I'll be right behind you." As Dr. Mercer secured herself inside, Morgan performed one final sweep, ensuring they hadn't been followed, that their deception had worked completely. The tracking device on Dr. Mercer's wrist showed no pursuit signatures. The hostile forces were still consolidating at the positions where they expected an attack, still responding to a threat that had never materialized. Morgan allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The analyst everyone had dismissed as a pencil pusher had just orchestrated a tactical deception that professional operators with years of field experience hadn't questioned once they understood the logic behind it. "Time to go, ma'am," Wilson called from the helicopter door, extending his hand. She was about to step forward when a single shot cracked through the mountain air. The impact threw her sideways, a searing pain blossoming across her left shoulder. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of light surrounded by encroaching darkness. Through that tunnel, she saw Wilson leaping from the helicopter, saw Davis changing position to provide covering fire, saw Dr. Mercer straining against the safety harness, trying to reach for her. All in a strange suspended slow motion that seemed to exist outside normal time. "Sniper!" Wilson shouted, his voice distorted and distant through the high-pitched ringing in her ears. "Southeast ridge, approximately 800 meters. Another shot kicked up dirt inches from Morgan's position. Then another. Precision fire from a position that shouldn't have been possible given their deception strategy. How? She managed to gasp as Wilson dragged her toward the helicopter, staying low to present the smallest possible target. "Questions later," he grunted, pulling her the final few feet to the aircraft. "Staying alive now." Inside the helicopter, Dr. Mercer was already pulling out a medical kit, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated field injuries before. "Pressure wound," she assessed quickly. "Through and through, missed major vessels from what I can see." Morgan tried to focus through the pain and the disorientation of blood loss. Something wasn't right. Their deception had been perfect. The tracking device had shown the hostile forces consolidating exactly where they'd wanted them, unless... "The tracking device," she said, grabbing Dr. Mercer's wrist. "Let me see it." Even as the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply to use the mountain ridge as cover from the sniper, Morgan examined the small device that had guided their evasion strategy. It looked exactly as it should, the same prototype she remembered from 16 months ago, with its distinctive casing and specialized display. Except for one detail. A tiny modification to the power source that wouldn't be noticeable to anyone who hadn't studied the original schematics as obsessively as Morgan had during the months following Blackwater. "It's been altered," she said, her voice steadying as the analytical part of her mind took over, pushing the pain into a compartment where it couldn't interfere with clear thinking. "They didn't just find your technology, they modified it." Dr. Mercer paled, taking the device back and examining the alteration Morgan had spotted. "A remote override capacity," she confirmed. "They could make it show whatever they wanted us to see." They knew we would use it to evade them, Wilson realized, applying pressure to Morgan's wound as the helicopter gained altitude. "They fed us false data." "No," Morgan corrected, wincing as the aircraft hit turbulence. "Not entirely false. They showed us exactly what they were doing, consolidating forces, but not all of them. They kept that sniper team off the grid, knowing we'd trust the tracking system. So they could catch us at the extraction point," Davis added grimly. Dr. Mercer looked stricken, the weight of responsibility heavy in her expression. I should have anticipated this. It's my technology. I should have known they'd find a way to subvert it. You couldn't have known, Morgan assured her, fighting to stay focused as shock threatened to cloud her thinking. That's why they've been hunting you for 16 months. Because you're the only one who could have detected the modification. The researcher's expression hardened with renewed determination. And now I have proof of exactly how far they've gone to weaponize my work. This modification itself is evidence of unauthorized development. As the helicopter stabilized at cruising altitude, heading back toward the secured landing zone where medical support would be waiting, Morgan forced herself to think through the implications of what had just happened. They risked exposing a covert sniper team, she said, more to herself than to the others. That means they're desperate. They know what's in your evidence package, and they're willing to break operational security to prevent it from reaching command. Wilson nodded, respect evident in his expression. Which means whatever you've got is even more important than we thought. Or more dangerous, Morgan added. Dr. Mercer clutched the weatherproof case that contained 16 months of painstakingly gathered evidence communications logs, development records, authorization chains that traced back to officials who should never have had access to her research. It's both, she said quietly. Important because it proves that Blackwater wasn't just a compromised operation. It was the beginning of something much larger. Dangerous because it implicates people at the highest levels of multiple agencies. The helicopter banked again, beginning its approach to the secure landing zone. Morgan could see medical personnel preparing for their arrival. Colonel Hargrove standing slightly apart, his posture tense with anticipation. "We made it," Davis said, relief evident in his voice. "Not yet," Morgan cautioned, her analytical mind still racing, connecting dots that others might miss. If they were willing to expose a sniper team, they might have contingencies at the landing zone as well. Wilson immediately activated his secure communications link. "Control, Bravo Actual. Be advised, potential security compromise at LZ. Recommend immediate sweep for unauthorized personnel or surveillance." Colonel Hargrove's voice came back immediately. "Already in progress, Bravo. Landing zone is secure. Medical team standing by for immediate extraction to base hospital." The relief in the helicopter was palpable, but Morgan knew better than to relax completely. Not until Dr. Mercer and her evidence were safely delivered to the secured intelligence center. Not until the data was analyzed and distributed to trusted officials who could act on it without being compromised. Not until the people who had been willing to erase entire operations, and the people involved in them, were held accountable. As they touched down, medical personnel rushed forward, transferring Morgan to a stretcher with practiced efficiency. Dr. Mercer stayed close, still clutching her evidence case, unwilling to let it out of her sight after 16 months of guarding it with her life. "Stay with her," Morgan instructed Wilson and Davis. "Full security protocol until she reaches the intelligence center." "Yes, ma'am," Wilson replied, the formality in his tone indicating a level of respect she hadn't heard from him in 16 months. "You focus on not bleeding out," Davis added with a hint of his usual sardonic humor. "We've got this." As they wheeled her toward the waiting medical transport, Morgan caught sight of Colonel Hargrove approaching, his expression a mixture of concern and barely contained excitement. "You did it," he said, walking alongside her stretcher. "Against all odds you brought her in." "We're not done yet," Morgan replied, fighting to stay conscious as the adrenaline began to fade, allowing the full impact of her injury to assert itself. "The evidence needs to be secured, authenticated, and distributed through secure channels." "Already arranged," Hargrove assured her. "Nasir has established an isolated communication network that can't be accessed or monitored by anyone outside our immediate team." "Good," she managed, her vision beginning to blur on the edges. "Because whoever sent that sniper will try again. They can't afford to let this evidence come to light." "Let me worry about that," the colonel said firmly. You've done your part. Now let the doctors do theirs. As they loaded her into the medical transport, Morgan found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. 16 months ago, she had been an analyst who followed protocols, who trusted the system even when her instincts told her something was wrong. 16 months of being dismissed and forgotten had transformed her into someone who questioned everything, who trusted her own judgment above any system or protocol. Someone who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is the person everyone underestimates. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the occasional rustle of movement as Dr. Mercer adjusted her position in the visitor's chair. She hadn't left Morgan's side since the surgery 8 hours earlier, maintaining her vigil with the same determined focus she'd applied to surviving 16 months on the run. You should rest, Morgan said, her voice still rough from the intubation during surgery. So should you, Mercer replied with a faint smile. And yet here we both are, still working. It was true. Despite doctors' orders to rest completely, Morgan had been remotely monitoring the preliminary analysis of Dr. Mercer's evidence package. The secure tablet beside her bed displayed real-time updates from the intelligence team, each new finding more disturbing than the last. They've authenticated the communications logs, Morgan noted, scanning the latest report. Confirmed that the order to compromise Blackwater came from within our own agency. Not just your agency, Mercer said quietly. The authorization chain crosses boundaries, intelligence, military, civilian oversight. A collaborative effort to weaponize surveillance technology beyond any legal or ethical framework. Morgan absorbed this, understanding the implications. This wasn't just about one compromised operation or one piece of misused technology. It was about a systematic attempt to create capabilities that could be deployed without accountability or oversight. How far did they get? With your technology? Dr. Mercer's expression darkened. Too far. The prototypes they developed after Blackwater have been deployed in at least 3 regions that I've been able to document. They're using it to identify and eliminate individuals based on predictive behavior patterns, not actual actions. Pre-crime, Morgan said, the reference to fiction feeling suddenly, chillingly real. Essentially, but without any of the ethical safeguards that even fiction would demand. No due process, no verification, no accountability. Just elimination of statistical probabilities. The door opened, admitting Wilson Davis and Colonel Hargrove. The operators looked tired but alert, still functioning on the heightened awareness that came from knowing the mission wasn't truly complete. Hargrove carried a secure communications device, his expression suggesting news of significance. The evidence package has been fully authenticated and distributed to secure channels, he announced without preamble. 3 director-level officials have already been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 2 more are being recalled from field positions. It's starting, Dr. Mercer said, a hint of vindication in her voice. After 16 months, it's finally happening. There's more, Hargrove continued. The sniper who shot you has been identified through ballistic analysis. Former special operations, working as a contractor for a private security firm with direct ties to the officials implicated in your evidence. Let me guess, Morgan said. The same firm that was providing security consultants for Blackwater 16 months ago. The very same. We're working to untangle the full network of connections, but it's clear that this goes beyond a few rogue officials. This was a coordinated effort to develop capabilities that could be deployed without congressional oversight or public knowledge. Morgan shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at her surgical site. And now that the evidence is out there, what happens next? Justice, Wilson said simply, speaking for the first time since entering the room. For everyone who was erased, silenced, or forgotten because they got in the way of whatever this was supposed to be. It won't be simple, Dr. Mercer cautioned. The people involved have resources, connections, contingency plans. They've been operating with impunity for years. Nothing worth doing is ever simple, Davis replied with unexpected philosophical depth. But nothing they've done would have come to light without you. He nodded respectfully to Dr. Mercer, then turned to Morgan. And without you. The acknowledgement from men who had spent 16 months dismissing her as nothing more than a pencil pusher felt like the closing of a circle that had begun with Blackwater. Not a return to where she'd started, but an arrival at somewhere entirely new. 3 days later, Morgan stood at the observation window overlooking the intelligence center, watching as analysts and operators worked together to unravel the full extent of the conspiracy that Dr. Mercer's evidence had exposed. Her arm was still immobilized in a sling, but she had refused to remain confined to a hospital room when there was work to be done. "You should be resting," Nasir said, joining her at the window. "So everyone keeps telling me. And yet here you are." "Here I am," she agreed. "Where I'm needed." Below them, the intelligence center hummed with purpose as teams traced connections, verified data points, and built the case that would eventually be presented to congressional oversight committees. Dr. Mercer moved between workstations, providing context and clarification where needed, finally able to use her expertise openly instead of hiding it. "They've authorized a new division," Nasir informed her. "Oversight and accountability, designed specifically to prevent another Blackwater from happening." "Let me guess," Morgan said with a faint smile. "They want you to run it." "Us," he corrected. "They want us to run it. You, me, Dr. Mercer. People who understand what it means to be erased from the system and what it takes to find your way back." Morgan considered this, watching the coordinated effort below. The analysts who had once ignored her insights now sought her approval on intelligence assessments. The operators who had dismissed her as a pencil pusher now incorporated her tactical suggestions without hesitation. Not because she had demanded their respect, but because she had earned it through competence, courage, and the willingness to trust her own judgment even when the entire system told her she was wrong. "Oversight and accountability," she repeated, testing the concept. "It has potential." "It has more than potential," Nasir insisted. "It has necessity. What happened with Blackwater, what happened to you and me and Dr. Mercer, it can't happen again. Not if we have anything to say about it." Morgan thought about the long journey from being dismissed as irrelevant to standing here, helping to reshape the very system that had once tried to silence her. About the difference between following protocols and creating better ones. About what it meant to truly serve the principles behind the badges and clearances and oaths. "When do we start?" she asked. "We already have," Nasir replied. "The moment you decided that being right was more important than being approved. The moment you chose to listen to someone everyone else had forgotten existed." 2 weeks later, Morgan Reeves stood in front of a newly assembled team of analysts and operators, all handpicked for their integrity and independence of thought. Her shoulder was healing well, though the doctors warned she might never regain full range of motion, a small price to pay for bringing truth to light. "Our mission is straightforward," she told them, surveying the room full of faces that represented the future of intelligence work as she now envisioned it. Oversight of operations that might otherwise escape scrutiny. Accountability for decisions that affect real lives. Transparency where secrets have been used to hide misconduct rather than protect security. She paused, noting how attentively they listened, not because of her rank or position, but because they had all read the now declassified summary of Blackwater and understood what had been at stake. "Some of you may be wondering why you were selected for this team," she continued. "It wasn't because you had the highest scores or the most impressive service records. It was because at some point in your career, you questioned an order that didn't make sense. You raised concerns that others dismissed. You insisted on answers when everyone else accepted silence." Dr. Mercer, now officially appointed as technical director of the new division, nodded in approval from her position at the back of the room. Beside her, Nasir watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found his way home after years in the wilderness. "The intelligence community calls people like us troublemakers," Morgan said with a slight smile. "Pencil pushers who don't know our place. Analysts who should stick to paperwork instead of asking inconvenient questions. Operators who should follow orders without wondering about the bigger picture." Wilson and Davis, now permanently assigned to her security detail by their own request, exchanged knowing glances. "But the truth is," Morgan continued, "those inconvenient questions are often the most important ones. The ones that prevent catastrophic misjudgments. The ones that save lives. The ones that ensure we remain true to the principles we all swore to uphold." She looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each member of her new team. Seeing in them the same qualities that had once made her an outcast and now made her exactly the right person to lead this initiative. "In this division, we don't dismiss voices because they're quiet. We don't ignore warnings because they're inconvenient. We don't silence people because they challenge the consensus. We listen, we verify. We act with integrity, especially when it would be easier to look the other way." The room was silent, every person present understanding the weight of what she was proposing, a fundamental shift in how intelligence operations were conducted and overseen. 16 months ago, I was wounded during an operation that officially never happened. I was silenced, sidelined, and forgotten because I refused to ignore what I saw. 2 weeks ago, I was wounded again, this time because I refused to stay silent. She touched her healing shoulder briefly, the physical reminder of what truth sometimes costs. The difference between then and now isn't just that the truth finally came to light. It's that now we have the authority and the responsibility to ensure that no one else has to make the choice between integrity and career, between doing what's right and doing what's expected. As the briefing concluded and the team dispersed to their assigned stations, Morgan found herself standing alone at the window overlooking the intelligence center, watching as a new approach to oversight and accountability began to take shape under her direction. Colonel Hargrove joined her, observing the activity below with evident satisfaction. "Quite a change from 16 months ago," he remarked. "Yes," she agreed. "But not because I'm different. I'm exactly who I always was. What's changed is that now people are listening. Sometimes it takes getting shot for people to pay attention," he said wryly. "It shouldn't," Morgan replied. "That's the whole point of what we're building here. No one should have to bleed to be heard." As she turned away from the window, she caught sight of a news broadcast playing silently on one of the monitoring screens. The headline scrolled across the bottom: "Senior intelligence officials resign amid allegations of unauthorized surveillance program." The beginning of accountability. The first step toward repairing a system that had allowed power to operate without oversight, technology to advance without ethics, operations to proceed without questioning. The first acknowledgement that sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else has dismissed. That sometimes when someone asks who's firing, where from, the answer comes from beneath the rubble of careers and reputations that powerful people tried to bury. Morgan Reeves hadn't set out to become a whistleblower or a reformer or the head of a new division dedicated to oversight. She had simply refused to stop asking questions that needed answers. Refused to be silenced when silence served the powerful rather than the truth. Refused to forget what it meant to serve with integrity, even when the system itself had lost its way. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone around her that courage isn't about fearlessness in the face of danger. It's about clarity in the face of pressure. About knowing what matters most when everything is on the line. About standing up after being knocked down. Finding your voice after being silenced, and continuing forward even when the path leads through darkness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.